Before we dive into today's lesson, let me just make sure that you're doing okay. Everybody survived exam 2 satisfactorily, and we're still making Globus decisions. I'll be sending you a separate email that will talk about some Globus Zoom chats that I want to have next week. And next week is April 6th or April 7th through the 11th. But it's very important to me that you are doing okay. If you're having problems with your internet connectivity, go to the distance education page, and there are a lot of services and companies that are offering some free and low cost internet and offering not to disconnect people if you're a current customer. In this environment of completing school online, good internet connectivity is a big deal. Also, if you're just trying to live off of your phone, then maybe contact your provider to see if you can get an up or an increase in your data limits so that you can stream more stuff from your phone without exceeding your data limits. Reach out to me if you have issues. Certainly it's hard on me to not see your faces and not be able to communicate with you face to face. Probably not nearly as hard that you're not seeing my face and able to communicate with me face to face. But do reach out to me if you're having issues or concerns, not just in this course, but in any of your courses, because these are trying times and we want to see you succeed. I want to see every single one of you graduate this spring. So let's work together to get that done. Let's get into the subject of the day. And I'm going to be honest right up front. Of all of the chapters in the textbook, I think they do the worst job with this topic. You're going to see in my commentary, I don't disagree with the textbook, but I explain it a very different way, and I introduce some factors that they don't talk about in the textbook because I'm just not sure that they do a very good job. You're also going to see that I don't cover a lot of the material that they do cover, which means you won't be tested on it come test time because I just don't think it's all that important. So let's dive in. Organizational structure seems like a very uninteresting subject. Beware. You may not be interested in it, but it is in fact very important. In fact, you'll see that when a new executive comes in and takes over a firm, often they spend a lot of time dealing with the organizational structure. So even though this subject may not jump out at you as being like, wow, this is one of the cool things we're going to learn in our class, this is actually one of the topics that you are most likely to put into practice, or at least be able to observe in your companies and where you're working early on. Now, we're going to talk about the various types of organizational forms, and we're going to talk about the strengths and weaknesses of each. What I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about them quite a bit differently than the textbook. I'm going to introduce three factors, accountability and responsibility being one of them. I can almost guarantee you will see a test question where you have to know what the term P&L means. P&L. P&L is how it's usually just said very quickly together like that. That stands for, and I hope everybody actually already knows that, but profit and loss. And so one of the things that we're going to talk about is who has accountability and who has responsibility in this organization, who has P&L responsibility. The next aspect is communication. How well does the organization share information? In a closely allied subject to that is cooperation. And the final issue is cost. And a lot of times where the cost comes from is, does this provide the most efficient structuring of your human capital and your also your actual capital and your facilities? They tend to vary on this. Excuse me, because some of the structures involve some duplication, and so it increases the cost. How does this usually work? Oh, I'm sorry, another key concepts I have to introduce. The textbook talks about financial controls versus strategic controls. Financial controls are easy. Now let's put it in terms of Globus. That would be things like your earnings per share, your return on equity. Strategic controls are, and the textbook does a great job of using the term subjective. In other words, these are things that are just not as established, not as defined, not as universally recognized. These are the things where you're saying these aspects or these metrics are important for my strategy. For example, market share, R&D spending. Those could be some some things in Globus that are a key part of your strategy and you would want to be paying attention to. We'll talk a lot more about this concept in the next chapter on something called the balanced scorecard. So I'm not really going to go in too deeply in that, but it is important to understand that as we do the pros and cons of the various organizational forms. Also, the textbook introduces three key concepts of structure. The specialization, which is how different are the various functions or the various tasks that have to be completed, how much expertise needs to be resident in the various functions to make that happen as well. Centralization, how well spread out is the decision-making authority, or is it not spread out at all? And then formalization, how well codified are all the processes and procedures that companies follow in this various organizational form. And so now, let's make it personal. Thus far, you've all been in Globus for many, many rounds. In fact, we're getting close to the finish line of Globus. Structure is actually about talent maximization. That's what organizational structure is trying to do. It's trying to maximize the talent that you have in the organization. And so the question becomes, how has your Globus team organization contributed to the maximization of your talent? Now, we're going to introduce a concept called functional structures, and you'll see in Globus, I've encouraged you to basically develop some functional expertise and some functional structures. But the point is the teams that do best in Globus often do so because everyone is engaged and everyone is doing their part and they're contributing. And so have you organized your personal Globus team in a way to maximize your talent? Well, my computer is hung up here. This is how it typically works. When businesses are formed and they're small, they start off in a simple structure. Then as they grow and they add sales, but especially add people, often they move to a functional structure. If they continue to grow, and particularly if they expand out on their product categories, then they often go into a multi-divisional structure. Now, some large firms can choose to stay as functional or versus multi-divisional. And then later on, we're going to see that really large firms try to achieve both of or organize to achieve the pros of both the functional and the multi-divisional structure. So let's talk about a simple structure. Many of you who work in small businesses work in an organization that has a simple structure. Everyone reports to the boss, who is often the owner. It's a very flat organization, and on my principles of accountability, cost, and communication, it's a low-cost structure. There's very little duplication of effort. There's one person who does each role. There might be some cross-training, but when there's a lot of cross-training, that says, using another degree, there's not a lot of specialization. Typically, there is a high degree of centralization of decision-making. That would be the boss, and often low formalization. They don't put much into writing. This organization, in fact, works very well, is so long as you've got a business of relatively small, I'll say 20 employees or less. There's nothing magical about that number 20. So this is a great way to organize until such time as the business grows to be too big or too complex. And then this structure fails because the boss can't make all the decisions, because there's not enough subordinate supervision, and it's not clear who's in charge of what. This is where the functional organization comes from. And it does exactly what it suggests. It organizes people into functions. And this is what you see. You see the various functions and how everybody, for example, in the personnel office, all works in the personnel office, and they all work for the personnel director. And then you have the marketing department, and everybody in the marketing department works for the marketing manager, and there's one of them. And they report, in larger firms, there may be a staff that sits above them. This might be the legal. Hard to know. Sometimes you don't have a lot of centralized staff if you have real strong functions, because those functions are already embedded into the functions, and then they report to the boss. This says office of the president. It could be the CEO, whatever. What are the pros of this? And the functional organization has some very specific pros. In terms of communication within the departments, within the functions, it's very clear. People talk to each other within these departments. there is a lot of, if we talk about specialization, this allows expertise development in these particular areas. In terms of cost, it tends to be a lower cost organization because there's not a lot of duplication. If you're an operations person, you work in the operations department, and you're clustered around a lot of other operations people there, and there's not necessarily a lot of duplication. Where this organization falls down, or its cons, are in two particular areas, and that is in accountability, and that is in communication and cooperation. And I have to say, in my professional career, I've seen this. I've seen where functional organizations, they do great in their specialization. These functions do what they do very well. But from the standpoint of accountability and responsibility, first of all, these people have to be assigned very clear strategic goals or metrics, strategic controls, whatever you want to call them, because that's what they get managed against, are those strategic controls. Crafting them so that they work well across all of the disciplines, or that they serve the company well, is extremely hard. For example, the personnel department, one of their goals may be that they keep a low personnel turnover. Okay, that sounds like a great goal. So this personnel director gets graded against their personnel turnover, and they have the hiring and firing authority. So what are they highly incentivized to do? Not fire anybody. Because if they fire them, well, that's going to that's going to be turnover, and that's contrary to their goal. And so now they're maximizing their goal, which is low turnover, and these people are all putting up with unacceptable workers who they're trying to fire, but the personnel department won't allow them to. Likewise, in engineering, they may be told your job is to drive down the cost of manufacturing of the product, and they do so. And they then, engineering and operations perhaps works together, assuming it's a manufacturing firm, and they drive down the cost of the product. And the marketing people are livid because, yes, they're achieving their goal. They're driving down the cost of organization, or the cost of manufacturing. And how do they do that? Well, they reduce the number of colors they produce in. Well, these people are telling them, we need these features. This is what the client wants. And they won't build them in because they're expensive features to build in. And so one of the weaknesses, to wrap it up, is this person is typically the only person with P&L responsibility. And it is very hard to design strategic goals for all of these entities that don't allow them to maximize their efficiency at the expense of other people's efficiencies. Also, how does the communication happen? The communication typically happens at the heads of these departments. These people down here that are in these functions, who do they talk to? They only talk to people in these functions. If there's an issue, if engineering has an issue with marketing that goes all the way to the top, these two people talk, goes down to here, maybe the problem gets solved, maybe it doesn't. And so the functional form can be plagued by a lack of communication and a lack of cooperation. How does it work in the different business strategies? A functional organization, particularly if it's a single or a limited number of products, works very well in a cost leadership sort of strategy because it does tend to be the low cost entity, but it can also work in a differentiation strategy as well. They do a big job of discussing this in the textbook, and I really think it's as simple as which of these functions, or what strategic goals do you issue to these functions, and maybe which of these functions gets a little more priority than the other. In a differentiation strategy, maybe you really put a lot of emphasis on research and development. Maybe you really put a lot of emphasis on marketing. In more of a cost leadership, you're focusing a lot on operations to really drive the cost out. So it works with both of those types of strategies. It's just a difference of how do you design the strategic goals for the different functions, and maybe shifting priorities between the two. So this isn't entirely satisfactory. Let's get into the next organization.